as well. So let's go over some different stitch types and talk a little bit about that so we have some basic knowledge there. So we'll start with the most fundamental and popular stitch type, and you'll be seeing this on field with the football jerseys when kickoff happens here in just a few short weeks, is a zigzag stitch. Zach, what do we know about a zigzag stitch?
Well, like you said, it is the most popular. It's typically used on knife or laser cut twills, and the stitch ratio is about 17, anywhere between 15 and 18 stitches per inch is what you're going to see on a typical zigzag stitch, which you'll see a huge difference between that and a satin stitch, and also from the fill stitching that we looked at.
Good. So this particular example that I'm showing you here, the dark charcoal would actually be a satin stitch. It almost looks like another color of fabric there, and then the orange stitching on the orange poly twill would be a zigzag stitch. So what do we know about a satin stitch?
The satin stitch is typically used to give the effect that you're seeing there, to get a second color without a second layer of fabric, to where it can be decreased machine time depending on how it's digitized. But a satin stitch, you're looking at anywhere from 55 to 75 stitches per inch compared to that 17 or 18 on the zigzag stitch. So 4 to 5 times as many stitches in a satin stitch design than a zigzag stitch.
Okay, so basically with the satin stitch, we're getting a completely different look, as you can see in the two stitch types here, but we're also getting a little bit more machine time, but sometimes that can be sort of balanced with the fact that we're picking up what looks like an extra color of twill or fabric that doesn't require that cutting and placement.
Correct.
Okay, and then the last stitch type that we're going to point out here today is what's called a bean stitch. So you can see it here in the context of a distressed applique on chino twill, which is just a little bit different fabric base, but tell us what you know about a bean stitch.
The bean stitch is typically used in these fashion applications where fraying can be desired, or on materials that don't have a tendency to fray, like a wool or an acrylic felt.
Yeah, something like this where you get an actual felt finish. You can see the sort of fuzzy texture to it, and you're still getting the bean stitch. So ultimately, as far as stitches per inch, this takes significantly less machine time than any of the other stitches.
Yeah, it's essentially the same as your lay down stitch.
Okay, which is very quick, very easy. So definitely would give you a lot of throughput. So just before I leave this station, I want to show you some different applique fabric types as well, if we can just back out the camera angle slightly. Here we go. So we have poly twill. Poly twill, once again, is the most basic. This is a rigid type of material. The advantage of poly twill is that in addition to being sort of the core product that powers most applications, the name poly implies that it's polyester based, and so you can start to pick up patterns in it when you start to apply technology such as sublimation on top of the twill. So in this instance, you're getting that sort of zebra stripe that's been sublimated onto white poly twill, finished with a neon green satin stitch with a little bit of direct embroidery where it says gift and more. So poly twill you can order in a variety of different ways. You can order it pressure sensitive, which means it has a sticky backing for easy placement. You can order it with a permanent adhesive if you just want to cut it with a laser and apply it without any stitch time, or you can order it basically uncoated without adhesive. So you can apply your own adhesive down for application or just sew it. But adhesive is always recommended in finishing with a heat press so you don't get that puckering after it's laundered. So that's poly twill, polyester-based twill in a few different varieties. And then once again, this is our chino twill, so we get our natural cotton type twill, much more prevalent in the fashion-forward designs, sort of an Abercrombie look, for lack of a better word. It's softer on the person that's wearing it. You can get cool distressed effects and really step it up a notch. And then you can go basically any fabric type can be used for applique, but this one is our wool felt. Also can be used is acrylic felt, so this gives you your fuzzy sort of texture to the finished fabric. And all of these are sewn applications, but rest assured with some suppliers, not only can you order the cut piece for sewing, you can order basically stuff with simulated stitches. So you can kind of see on the edge of this, it looks like it's sewn, it has that sort of edge to it, but it's just heat applied. So for those of you without embroidery, yes, you can partner with a local embroiderer to complete your sewn applications, or you can order something like Sim Stitch that looks sewn but is just heat applied. And the Sim Stitch is, you know, a product that can be ordered in patterns as well. So you get a lot of different finishes. that's a little bit about stitch types and applique fabrics. Now I'm going to jump over here to a relatively new process for applique called Away Applique. And the real beauty of this process for an embroiderer, Zach, is that there is no cutting involved.
Right. So vinyl cutter, that flatbed cutter, knife, or laser isn't necessary for this process.
So it drives some simplicity. Once again, we have our placement stitch. Rather than having to lay down individual pieces, you get the advantage of laying down a panel of a film-based product. This is a polyurethane film. Particular versions, thermofilm, has like a leather-like appearance. So you notice we're sewing that satin stitch that we learned about. The satin stitch is actually cutting the material for you. It's perforating it. Mm-hmm. So a couple key things here. One, you're going to take a little bit more machine time with Away Applique because we are sewing the satin stitch. Not only is it a satin stitch, it's a denser satin stitch to make sure it's perforating the material accurately for ripping away. You can't sew a zigzag or a bean stitch here. Once you sew it, you rip away and you finish it with a heat press, and you can see some of the finishes here. We have, leather-like with thermofilm. There's glitter, flock. If we keep going on down, there's a reflective, which gives you sort of some high visibility into a sewn application. And then, once again, we're seeing the use of patterns, in this case, with a solvent printable material. So, a real quick demo before we conclude this section on Away Applique. I have a sample here. This has just been sewn out. We did this at our Stahls TV grand opening, where we did 2 colors of twill, a red and a white with a zigzag stitch, and then we finished it and combined the processes with a glitter flake Away Applique. So the concept is, you just sew that satin stitch, make sure it's dense enough, and then you are just going to rip away this excess material. Make sure you peel out any center components to kind of clean it up. You want to keep some tweezers or snips or a weeding tool nearby. But basically within minutes, we're cleaning this up. Kind of the equivalent of weeding for heat transfer film, right? But it's much better than individually placing all these components. And once I've concluded here, I finish that with a heat press and I have a completed design. So pretty powerful technology.
Yeah, one of the other things, Josh, that we kind of didn't mention, what the satin stitch does, not only does it give you a 2 or a 3 color option without putting the fabric down, it also makes it a bit lighter weight. So people can substitute a satin stitch on garments that require a lighter weight application that might not normally respond well to applique or some type of heavy thing on it, but the satin stitch will lighten that up.
Right, so hopefully this is a little bit of baseline. The idea here is we started with the challenge of embroiderers, and that's basically you're limited on your throughput unless you want to invest tens of thousands of dollars in additional throughput or another machine. Mm-hmm. So hopefully this gives you some ideas on how you can kind of take your embroidery business to the next level, or even considerations as you're looking to invest in embroidery, whether or not it's the right direction for you. Here are some different looks and finishes that you can execute in your shop.